Welcome everybody back into Nerd Sesh. As always, I'm Carson Breber and alongside me is Logan Camden. And today we are going to be previewing in depth both conference final series. If you are watching on YouTube, we are going to do this in two separate parts, and we apologize for the wait. We promised we would get this up today, and we still are, but a little later than expected due to some technical difficulties. So Logan, we're going to start with Mavericks-Timberwolves, which to me is pretty clearly the more exciting of the two series. What's the first key that stands out to you here?
The first key to me, Carson, is really what level of Luka Doncic we get in this series. You know, Luka has been dealing with a ton of injuries in these playoffs, and we've seen some encouraging games from him, especially the last two to close out Oklahoma City. But in the second round, he was just 24 points on 53% true shooting with 4 turnovers a night. And in these playoffs, he's 27, 10, and 9 on 52% true shooting with just under 4 turnovers a night. He's just consistently been below the elite and excellent and nearly perfect level that we've come to expect from Luka Doncic. And the biggest area that I've noticed is pull-up jumpers. Luka is really relying on this shot in his diet, man. It's one of the tenets of his game. It's where it's his bread and butter. In the regular season, he averaged 15 pull-up points per game, 41% overall on jumpers, and 38% on pull-up threes. In these playoffs, he's averaging 3 less points per game on pull-up jumpers, 5% less overall, and 8% worse on pull-up threes. And, that's against an Oklahoma City team that, has a really great point of attack defender in Lu Dort, but I think his matchup gets even more difficult here against Minnesota, having to go up against the likes of Jaden McDaniels, against Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Anthony Edwards. I just think the overall defense is a lot better, and it's going to be that much more difficult for Luka to manufacture offense. Like, Minnesota hounded and pestered Jamal Murray all series long. They held Jamal Murray to 18 points per game on 40% overall from the field, 33% from deep, and just 48% true shooting. I truly think this is going to be the toughest test of Luka's career, man, considering the fact that he's not at 100% and considering the personnel that he's facing up against. Now, we did see in the regular season these guys face off. Dallas, Luka and Kyrie only play one game together in the regular season series, and we also don't see the new look Mavericks. But we do see Luka matched up against these perimeter defenders. Against McDaniels, Luka put up 31 points and 8 assists on 52% from the field, and consistently physically overpowered Jaden McDaniels. I think that Minnesota has the length advantage here. They're just longer than Luka. They'll be able to contest some shots, but I think Luka has a distinct weight and physicality advantage against these guys. I will say, I think Luka looks a little bigger than he did in the regular season matchups. Like, I think he's a little heavier since then, so I don't know how that's going to affect him stamina-wise. And so that's my first big key is what Luka we get, but I think I would try to physically wear him down in this series, Carson, if I'm Minnesota. And what I mean by that is I'm playing him super physically. I'm up in his airspace all series long. If that means I'm picking him up full court, I'm just trying to wear him down, man. Like, I think this is going to be a long series. I think it goes 6 or 7 games. And I am trying to wear Luka down throughout, man. I'm going to pressure the hell out of the ball. I want to frustrate and fluster him as much as I can. And I'm just going to sell out to make sure that I'm just playing him super physically, man. I want Luka to be worn down. He's already banged up. He's dealing with a myriad of injuries. And so if I'm the Timberwolves, I'm going to try to take advantage of that, and I'm going to try to play him even more physically and try to wear him down throughout this series, man. I want him hobbled if we're going into extra games, Game 6, Game 7, if I'm the Timberwolves. So that's my first big key, man. I think it comes down to the superstars, but with his injuries and this specific tough matchup, what version of Luka Doncic do we get is the biggest key to me.
This is a massive key in this series because when we zoom out and think big picture where these players rank among the best in the league, I think Luka is the best dude left in the playoff field, but he hasn't played like it in these playoffs due to a combination of the knee and some of the various other nagging injuries that he has and his jumper going ice cold, as you mentioned. But he did find a rhythm over those last 2 games of the OKC series and played pretty clearly his best basketball so far. So I do think that's encouraging for Dallas, that although Luka hasn't played close to our expectations over the course of this run so far, he was peaking at least the last time that we saw him. That is encouraging. But there are several keys that stand out for him in this series in my eyes, some of which are under his control and some of which are matchup specific to dealing with this incredible Minnesota defense and how they approach him. Key number 1, as you mentioned, is his jump shot. Like, the difference between bad Luka games and good Luka games has been made up of multiple things, but one of the biggest indicators has just been, are those pull-up jumpers falling? In losses, he is 21% from deep in these playoffs. In wins, he's 35%. And he's going to rely on that heavily because, as you mentioned, it's just a crucial part of his shot diet to begin with, but especially with his knee, making him a bit more hesitant to drive, especially against a defense this physical, like he just has to be on as a pull-up shooter. And he was on over his last 2 games, but it has been a real roller coaster throughout these playoffs. The second key that stands out to me that is mostly within Luka's control is his aggression getting downhill, because as we've talked about, he has been very, very prone to settling for these pull-up jumpers, but when those looks are off, he just has to be willing to attack that paint. That is still where he is most effective as a basketball player, and I believe that the knee has been a factor in deterring him from doing that. I think specifically in the OKC matchup, he was so consistently seeing 2 defenders that it just made a lot more sense for him to play make, and if he was attacking in isolation, he was more inclined to take pull-up jumpers than deal with this great OKC interior defense. But I still think it is just on him to get into that painted area. In wins, again, we look at the splits. Luka's averaged 8.5 points per game inside of 8 feet in these playoffs. In losses, 4.5 points per game. I want to see him consistently getting to those looks, those short-range floaters, those layups, especially when his pull-up jumper is off, because if he just goes down with the ship and is missing those looks, then Dallas isn't going to win this series. Then you have to think about the specific challenges that this Minnesota defense poses, because how he handles their physicality and their nonstop defensive intensity is going to be massive, because he was clearly very frustrated with the officiating throughout last series, and at some points was just thrown off by Lu Dort's physicality, and he just kind of lost his composure. And if you're pissed off and thrown off by that, you're in store for something else with Minnesota, because this team is applying the most intense ball pressure that we've seen, and they also have the most impressive depth of real elite point of attack defenders who they can throw at you. OKC would be the closest thing, but outside of Lou especially, like, there's just a different level of physicality with this Minnesota group. So that ball pressure is coming, and you have to protect the ball, which has been an issue for Luka at times in this run. You have to play through fouls. Like, whining isn't going to get you anywhere. Think about game 2 for the Nuggets in this past series. Extremely physical basketball game. And what did they do? Jamal Murray got rattled. And yeah, he was struggling because they were playing super physically, but he kept on looking to the refs and he throws a heat pack on the floor. Like, you cannot lose your composure, because they are going to play very physically, and they are probably mostly going to be allowed to because it's playoff basketball. I expect them to put Jaden McDaniels on him as the primary matchup. I think that the key there is just how excellent his screen navigation is, because nobody is better at manipulating screens than Luka Doncic, right? Just his ability to play with such special pace, and he is going to find the angle. He's going to trap you on his back. Ant, to me, is just too inconsistent in terms of his screen navigation. He does bring the strength element that Jaden doesn't quite have, but Jaden is, to me, just a much more consistent defender, and he does have the length applying back pressure. And then they have the luxury of mixing in doses of Alexander Walker and Ant and Kyle Anderson to give him different looks, and I expect them to do all of that. Like, Kyle Anderson, Logan, you may laugh, guarded him well in the regular season. He's a great defensive player. Not a good offensive player, but he's 6'9" with a 7'3" wingspan, moves his feet really well, has great hands. Like, in terms of bench defenders, it doesn't really get much tougher than that. In terms of how Minnesota approaches guarding Luka schematically beyond just the primary matchup, I expect them to play things more straight up than OKC. When Rudy is involved in the action, I fully expect him to play straight drop. I think that they'll have the other bigs come up to the level of the screen because they're not the same deterrence as drop defenders. And when it's a non-big involved as a screener, I think they'll probably do less outright blitzing than we saw OKC do, because they have the best personnel in the league to play the Mavs in a more straight up fashion, where you're not just consistently leaving corner shooters, right, and sending 2 to the ball every time. They have multiple elite perimeter defenders with great length, so there's more switchability there. Even though OKC has good options, it's a different level with Minnesota. And then you play a traditional drop coverage, you funnel them into the best drop defender in basketball with great back pressure. I just think you're bleeding less advantages in that way. Like, I still expect some blitzes when Luka and Kyrie heat up, and I do think it's matchup specific. Like, for example, if you have Derrick Jones Jr. screen for Luka, and then they're hunting that switch with Mike Conley, that's where things get a little bit dicey, because also Derrick Jones Jr. has been great as a roller, but you think you probably have to blitz there. because, or at least you have to hedge, you don't want Conley straight up matched up with Luka. That's the one problematic matchup that I would identify for Minnesota. But if Conley's getting hunted, you have the luxury of playing Alexander Walker-Moore, who, if he's knocking down his shots, is just a really, really good basketball player. So I do think that OKC just hemorrhaging those wide open threes was costly. Dallas was second in wide open threes last series, and they made 45% of them. And just considering that Luka's knee clearly isn't 100%, like, I would be willing to test him more straight up because you have such great defensive personnel. And you know that he's always going to make the right decisions as a playmaker. Force him to consistently beat you with that scoring. And him scoring in isolation in this matchup isn't going to be easy. So I still expect Luka to be the best offensive player in this series, but this is the toughest matchup possible against the best defense in the league. And I think his efficiency will take a hit for sure. And he is going to be made to work for 48 minutes of every game.
100%. You mentioned that, Luka is one of the best offensive players in the world, but I think the best player in these playoffs thus far is probably being Anthony Edwards. And I think another key dynamic here is the star matchup that we get in this one, and that's, can Anthony Edwards continue to be the best player in these playoffs? You mentioned this our last show, Carson. He's shooting 44% on pull-up jumpers. That's up 8% from the regular season. And he's shooting 37% on pull-up threes. That's up 4% from the regular season. And in these playoffs overall, he's 29 points, 6 boards, and 6 assists on 62% true shooting, just under 40% from deep. He's been phenomenal. And I also question what kind of coverage Anthony Edwards faces in this one too, because Denver didn't have any good answers, right? Like, any coverage that they went with, they were getting beat with something else, right? You move Aaron Gordon off of him, Karl-Anthony Towns is going to face a smaller defender consistently, right? You're throwing doubles at him, it just is leaving open guys everywhere. But I also think, much like you said about Luka and facing doubles last series, I think that Dallas has much better defensive personnel where they shouldn't. Now, I think you should throw some surprise doubles at, mix up coverages, but I don't think you're doing that consistently as much as Denver was. And I'm kind of content with single coverage versus PJ or Derrick Jones Jr. In the regular season, Derrick Jones Jr. held Anthony Edwards to 31%. I obviously don't think that's going to continue, but he defended him pretty well in the regular season. And I think my focus with Anthony Edwards, Carson, contain dribble penetration. I'm trying to funnel him out of the paint and force him into those mid-range pull-ups, man. Like, that's just the best chance. Now, obviously, containing Anthony Edwards on ball is easier said than done, but when you're forcing him to settle for pull-up jumpers, that's just a better offense, man. You don't want to get him into the paint. And also, this is a much better just interior group that Anthony Edwards is going to be facing, Carson. Dallas is holding opponents to 56% inside 5 feet. That's number one in the playoffs. And in between 5 and 9 feet, Dallas is holding opponents to 37%. Like, they have been swarming in there, man. That's the big key to me too, man, on the flip side. Like, Anthony Edwards has been the best player in these playoffs. Can he continue this torrential pull-up jump shooting run? And can he continue being as effective as he has been offensively, man? I think this is a much tougher defensive coverage and just overall defensive personnel that he's going up here against in Dallas. Overall, on the perimeter, on the interior, basically in every area, this is a tougher matchup for Anthony Edwards.
So, when we talk about the schematic approach, I actually think that Denver approached things correctly throughout last series. Well, yeah, dude, they slowed the Minnesota offense down for the most part after the first couple of games. That wasn't the problem in Game 7. The problem was that they couldn't produce offensively. Minnesota shot 39% from the field in that game. I just think he is pretty much unguardable on an island right now. Like, that is where he has been at his best. Derrick Jones Jr. is awesome. He is a better answer, certainly, than KCP just because of size and length. But Ant is still just so damn strong, and that's where in isolation, especially when he's on as a mid-range shooter, right, he just hits you with a bump and then gets those turnarounds, or he's just so overwhelmingly explosive that I don't think even Derrick Jones Jr. can stick with him on an island. He's averaged 1.17 points per isolation and 1.43 points per post-up in the playoffs. Just absolutely ridiculous. So I would try to force the ball out of his hands more. And I think you put the burden on the other guys to beat you. Now, you don't have to be excessive about it. And if Ant is off as a pull-up shooter, then you can probably live with playing him more straight up because, as you mentioned, his pull-up jumper has been great over the course of these playoffs, but over the last 3 games, he has an effective field goal percentage of 37 on those pull-up jumpers. So he has very much come down to earth just over these last 3 games, and Minnesota needs him to be excellent. They need him to be consistent as a pull-up shooter, and they need him to be relentless as a downhill scorer as well. I do not think that Dallas will switch as much as they did against OKC when they were comfortable switching everything, because Minnesota has grown men on the interior in a way that OKC just didn't. Cat's mismatch attacking is too good, and Rudy, it's not going to be pretty. Maybe you don't even give him the ball off a switch, but he'll clean up the glass in those situations. So I would still be willing to trap Ant and double out right at times and force him to make those passes to Rudy, which we know he doesn't love to do. And if you tag him, Rudy can struggle if it's against a capable, decently sized athlete, and you force Ant to try to make those skip passes, which he hasn't done. Dallas is a different defense than Denver. They don't play a lot of those like high drop and tag looks like Denver is used to, which makes the coverage a bit more natural for them. But I do think they had a good formula. Their offense just couldn't pull through at the end. So there is an immense burden on Ant here to keep this offense going, because we know that is the one concern with Minnesota that remains out there, that this was an average regular season offense, and you are going up against a high-powered offense with 2 superstars on that side of the ball. But I have faith in Ant with the level that he's playing at right now, and I have faith in this collective Minnesota offense to do enough, because Ant doesn't have to outplay Luka offensively. He just can't get completely outplayed there. Minnesota is going to win this series with their defense, with their size, and with their depth. That is where their advantages are. Ant just has to do enough, and I believe that he can. We are this close to crowning an NBA champ, and with the action heating up on the court, it's even hotter at DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NBA.
There's only so many games left, and DraftKings Sportsbook has you covered with same-game parlays, live bettings, odd boosts, and so much more. Don't miss out, or you'll have to wait until next NBA season to place your bets. It's super easy for first-timers to get started. Try betting on something simple like picking a team to win. Go to the DraftKings Sportsbook app, select your squad, and place your first bet. It's that simple.
New to DraftKings? Listen up. New customers can get a no-sweat bet up to $1,500. Just deposit at least $5 and you'll get a bonus bet back equal to your first bet if it doesn't hit. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use code NERDS. That's code NERDS for new customers to get a no-sweat bet up to $1,500 if your first bet doesn't hit. Only on DraftKings. The crown is yours.
I just want to add some additional numbers to what you were saying, too. Minnesota had an offensive rating of 106.1 in their 3 losses, and consistently, dude, we're just slow starting out the gate against Denver. In the first half of these playoffs, well, not even against Denver, too, this is overall, in these playoffs, an offensive rating of 106.7 in the first half. You contrast that within the second half when they put up an offensive rating of 125.8. Like, it's staggering, man. They have been a completely different team out of the second half, and there is a massive burden on him. There's also a massive burden, I think, too, because of the potential coverages that Ant could take on Karl-Anthony Towns. And the next big key to me is which team has the better secondary star, right? We've seen kind of ups and downs from both of these guys, Karl-Anthony Towns and Kyrie Irving. Cat, honestly, more so over than anything, has just been him staying on the floor and making boneheaded decisions. Like, when the boy's been out there, he's been mismatch attacking really well. He's been knocking down open looks. Outside of that one game where he just kept backing guys down with no bag, like just sticking his elbow into guys' chests, it's been a really good playoffs for Cat. 19 points on 52, 44, 83 splits, a true shooting percentage of 63. And on the flip side of this, it's can Kyrie Irving get going early too, man. And it's not just on Luka. Like, that's the thing about facing this Minnesota defense, is they have a surplus of elite defenders, man. It's not just guys on the interior. It's not just the starters. Like, there are so many different configurations that Minnesota can go with against Dallas that Kyrie and Luka are just going to be facing guys who are really freaking long, who are really, they're hounds. And so this is the toughest matchup for both of these guys. And when Luka is struggling, because I almost think it's an inevitable thing, Carson, right? Pull-up jump shooting is so volatile. There's going to come a game or a half or a stretch in this series where Luka's off. And to me, that is when Kyrie Irving just has to have that innate instinct that I got to take this game over. I got to go and serve buckets. And so even with him, Carson, I think the bigger offensive burden is on Luka and Kyrie, and you may think I think they're better offensive players than both Karl-Anthony Towns and Ant. But what you mentioned with the defense, Minnesota wins on the back of their defense and their work on the interior and the way they can dominate on that side of the ball. And this is no slight at Dallas. Dallas has won games like that in these playoffs, but they more so win offensively. And so it is just such a hellacious matchup for both of these guys going up against this elite perimeter defense. And I think the bigger burden between the secondary stars is on Kyrie because Cat's consistently going to be taking on smaller guys or he's going to be getting open looks because Ant's going to be getting doubles. Kyrie doesn't really have that benefit, man. He's going to be taking on single coverage against big, long, strong defenders. And he's been great in these playoffs. 21, 4, and 5 on 60% true shooting, over 44% from behind the arc. But I think the bigger burden is on Kyrie, and that's the other big dynamic, man, is who's going to be better as the secondary star. And I think with how up and down Luka's been, I think the bigger burden is on Kyrie producing when Dallas desperately needs it.
The defense has honestly been the more consistent strength for both these teams in the playoffs, in my opinion. It's just on a different level with Minnesota because we're not just talking about a really good defense. We're talking about a generational defense. So that is where they are going to win this series. They don't have to be as skilled offensively in a vacuum. And like I fully expect Kyrie to have a better series than Cat because also I think Minnesota has more depth. But Kyrie is crucial in this series because as we've discussed, Logan, he's mostly been Dallas's best player in these playoffs. Now, over the last 2 games, that has changed. Luka's done his thing, but he is the special sort of weapon who can go toe-to-toe with either Ant or who can outperform Luka in stretches that just very, very few teams have. That sort of guy as a number 2 option. And he ate Minnesota alive in the one game that they played this year. He had 35 on 64% true shooting. And when we talk about how Minnesota is going to match up with Dallas, the concern with Ant against Kyrie is, again, screen navigation, because early in that game, Kyrie was targeting him because he was just able to get downhill. He was able to spring free coming around those screens, and off ball, Ant was losing him some. So for a lot of the closing stretch, they put McDaniels on Kyrie, they put Ant on Luka, but I do think that they'll start with Ant on Kyrie because they want their best perimeter defender on Dallas's best offensive player. But Minnesota just needs Ant locked in defensively. And I thought that his screen navigation was quite good in game 6 and 7 on Jamal. I thought that he really did an awesome job in that matchup. And again, he does bring a unique sort of physicality and has such great hands, and as an isolation defender is ridiculous. So I still feel good about him in this matchup. He just needs to be dialed in. And you need aggressive Kyrie if you're Dallas. You need him to be outstanding as a shot maker because he did a great job of facilitating in this past series, but I don't think it's going to be as much about that in this one. I do think there's going to be more pressure on him to be a scorer in difficult matchups, and I think that he'll fare pretty well. He's Kyrie Irving. He's one of the best pure shot makers we've ever seen. It's just how much of that efficiency and production can Minnesota take away with their special defense. You talk about Cat. I do think he has to be consistent, and I think we need to see all the good stuff from him. Under control, selective mismatch attacking. As you mentioned, he'll have opportunities there, like PJ Washington straight up. Okay, we can see that a few times. It's definitely a better matchup than Aaron Gordon, but he still doesn't have overwhelming physical advantages. If he's going to go at him, it should be with deep post position, and then I think he can win there, but we don't want the drawn-out isolations that start from the three-point line and involve 8-10 dribbles, and there's time for a double to come and time for Cat to lose the handle. Be selective in those spots. Let it fly from deep. He's 44% from deep in these playoffs. There's not a Cat 3 right now that I don't like. And collectively, Minnesota's spot-up shooting just has to be consistent, because if Minnesota were to lose this series, that's where it would be. It would be on the offensive side of the ball. It would be Ant isn't super consistently playing at the level they need, that superstar level, or, and maybe even combined with that, Dallas is forcing the ball out of his hands and the guys around him are struggling to make shots. But I ultimately believe in the Minnesota supporting cast enough. Like, this team was third in three-point percentage in the regular season. I always trust Mike Conley as a secondary playmaker and as a pure shooter. Jaden McDaniels is in rhythm right now. And again, the key that we keep coming back to, they don't have to be more skilled. It doesn't have to be prettier. They are bigger and they are stronger, and there is a consistent floor with that on both sides of the ball.
Yeah, and that segues right nicely into a key, man. Who wins a battle on the interior? It's going to be huge in this series, man. These are two big ass teams. Like Minnesota's obviously the biggest remaining in the field, but Dallas is pretty big themselves, man. Minnesota is second in rebound rate in these playoffs. Dallas is sixth, but it's very marginal. Dallas is second in offensive rebound rate in these playoffs, and Minnesota's fourth. Like, I'm expecting a war on the glass. Like, I think that's going to be crucial in this one, man. And the final key I wanted to mention too, Carson, you talk about how Minnesota's half-court offense, or, it doesn't have to be pretty, it doesn't have to be beautiful and skilled. I also think it's crucial for Dallas to limit as many mistakes as possible. And it's hard against Minnesota's defense too, but there were games against Denver that Minnesota just single-handedly swung off of, huge just swings, like big turnovers, big blocks into easy points, easy steals into easy points. And if you were ever, that was what was so noticeable, man, is if like Denver ever was comfortable, and they got comfortable a lot in certain situations, especially Jamal Murray. Ant was picking that pocket. He was taking it coast to coast. Like, there have been stretches in these first two rounds where Luka is just playing a little lackadaisical, man. Oh, I'll fire this pass. I'll get loosey-goosey with my handle. You cannot do that against Minnesota because they will make you pay. This is an elite team at forcing turnovers, and they're an elite team in transition, at turning those turnovers into easy points. Like, I think it is crucial that Dallas just does not gift them anything easy because Minnesota will 100% capitalize. I think you have to make them work in the half court. That is an advantage that I think Dallas has, is slow the pace down, don't make mistakes, make sure you are maximizing each possession and getting a look or a shot or an opportunity to get an offensive board. Like, don't gift Minnesota anything easy because you are just playing into their hand and how they want to play basketball. And that is a big concern of mine. Like, Luka had some out-of-control games where he was just committing too many turnovers, he was making too many mistakes, he was dribbling the air out of the ball, and he was making bad passes. Like, that's a big key to me too, man, is Dallas limiting mistakes and just not giving anything easy to Minnesota.
And the ball pressure is incredibly difficult to deal with, especially when you aren't particularly quick. That's how it ate the Suns alive. That's how it ate Jamal Murray, especially with a calf strain alive. Like, those dudes are all super, super skilled, but they aren't able to beat that sort of full court pressure just by getting a step on those dudes. So that's where maybe Kyrie is more useful as the ball handler, bringing the ball up the floor, just because I do think he's quicker. And so he might be more comfortable dealing with that level of intense pressure. But that just speaks to the greatness of this Minnesota defense, dude. You talk about their ability to turn defense into offense, which they have consistently done, and that was pivotal in the Denver series. They're a historically great unit. In their wins against Denver last series, Logan, they held the Nuggets to a 93.8 offensive rating. That is a Denver team that last year posted an offensive rating throughout the playoffs of 118, the best that we have seen by a champion. Like, legitimately, just such outstanding stuff, especially at their peaks, like some of the best defensive performances we've seen in quite some time. Nobody has the personnel they do when you're talking about elite defenders, both on the perimeter and the interior. Nobody brings the physicality and the intensity like they do. And as we've already mentioned, like, Luka's had some frustrations with playoff physicality. Dallas also has just gotten punched in the mouth early in a few games. You think about game one against the Clippers, game one against the Thunder, where they just come out lackadaisical and they fall way behind. If that happens against Minnesota, like, your laziness, your lethargy is just compounded by the fact that they are that intense, they are that athletic, they are that physical, and so you can't afford that. You have to be extremely focused if you're Dallas. And along with this physicality that we're talking about, you already mentioned it, I do think Minnesota has a significant advantage on the glass. Like, Dallas is much improved there, but this is a big, big challenge, man. And they have dealt with, when you're talking about their playoff rebounding rate, a pretty average rebounding team in the Clippers, and then just an awful rebounding team with the Thunder. Whereas Minnesota has gone up against Phoenix, who you don't think of as a great rebounding team, but they were 7th in regular season rebounding rate. They grabbed 58% of all available rebounds in that series. And then going up against Denver, who's a top 5 rebounding team in the league, like, is the team who you think of as being huge alongside Minnesota, they still grabbed 52% of available rebounds, and that's where they won the series in the final minutes of Game 7. So I think Minnesota is just really tough to match up with there, and I do think Dallas is going to struggle to succeed in that department as they have up to this point in the playoffs. The last big thing that stands out to me, Logan, is the question of depth. And starting with Dallas's offensive supporting cast, they were really good last series, but I also think some dudes overperformed. Like, that's what's interesting. To me, last series said much more about PJ Washington and Derrick Jones Jr. and Derek Lively doing what he did in Game 6. All those dudes stepping up, and I believe in that unit defensively. I want to be clear. Like, I think that's the beauty of the team that Dallas has built. Those dudes are consistently going to defend their asses off. But they had a real offensive burden because of how much attention was being dedicated to Luka and Kyrie, and they stepped up. PJ, though, goes from being a 32% three-point shooter in the regular season to 47% last series. Derrick Jones Jr. goes from 34% from deep to 37% plus. And they got a lot of good looks by design. But as we talked about, I don't expect Minnesota to concede as many open threes, so those guys won't be working with an advantage as much. And then I wonder how productive they'll be offensively. Whereas for Minnesota, I just love their depth. Like, I like Dallas's depth. Minnesota's on a different level, though, and it's not necessarily just about offensive punch, but it is about the versatile offensive punches they can throw at you while maintaining this special defensive identity. Like, Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Naz Reid just have game-swinging potential every night. And beyond Dallas's starting five, they don't have a dude who you could say has that, in my opinion. Like, Derek Lively, sure. Him and Gafford I almost view as co-starters just because it's like, you know, they're both going to play 24 minutes. You ride with whoever's playing better. Like, we're talking about different looks. We're talking about, okay, let's take Conley off the floor because he's getting hunted defensively, and we're going to have one of the best defensive players on the planet, and now we can switch 1 through 3 so easily, and you're dealing with an elite perimeter defender no matter what. We're talking about, okay, Cat's in foul trouble, let's bring in Naz Reid, and we are maintaining so much of his value offensively, and defensively, Naz has been so good in this run. And also just the reality that Dallas has two guys who absolutely should be two of the 3 best players in this series. And offensively, again, there's the ceiling. They could be the 2 best offensive players in this series. I wouldn't predict it. You can't discount the possibility. But Minnesota has 3 star-level impact guys, and their 4th and 5th starters are really good NBA players who, honestly, I trust more night to night than Dallas's 4th and 5th guys, as impressive as they've been. So I do think that that's an advantage for Minnesota in this series, as good as Dallas's supporting pieces were last series.
Yeah, I think you hit on the big thing is that, you know, PJ Washington and Derrick Jones Jr. aren't going to be facing, they're not just going to be spraying wide open corner threes in this series. They're not going to have as easy looks because Minnesota can match up individually with all these guys. So I think it's a lot more on where else can you create advantages? You know, I think it's a lot on them cutting at opportune times and just finding open space. I think it's about maybe running more pick and roll with these guys and, you know, just running more deliberate actions. Like, it's just, there were so many, dude. I love that word, man. You said hemorrhaging earlier with Oklahoma City. Yeah, dude. They were getting killed. They were getting bludgeoned with those open looks.
But they were willingly doing it. Can I just say something real quick as an aside?
Sure.
In reference to that series, I didn't realize this was going to be a thing, but I saw a lot of people talking about how SGA's man, PJ Washington or Derrick Jones Jr., whoever it was hitting a bunch of open threes, and then they took that and said, SGA's a terrible off-ball defender. SGA's actually quite a good off-ball defender. He's a better off-ball defender than on-ball defender. He was being used as a free safety. He was directed to roam off of those dudes, and he blew up a bunch of plays. Like, he was consistently there, crowding these roles, helping on drives. He averaged over 3 stocks per game in that series. Like, you look at his opponent field goal percentage at the rim, he held people like 10% below their average. So, yes, they are allowing open threes, and SGA is that guy's man, but SGA is being told, don't worry about that guy. That's a coaching issue if you have a problem with it. That's not an SGA issue. He did his job well.
Yeah, it's no. I mean, it's a great point. It's a schematic decision. It's like, you know, when they're talking about Rudy being taken off Jokic, and it's like,
of course,
that's the point. Cat,
yeah.
They want Gobert in the helper role, and Cat, in my opinion, physically walls up Jokic better than Gobert does. So it's a decision. Yeah. That's foolish. That's foolish, man. But bottom line, those guys' jobs gets a lot tougher offensively, and there's going to be a lot more burden on those guys to create their own looks or to generate open looks for other guys. And so if I'm Dallas, I'm running more actions. Those guys just aren't going to sit in the corner for me. But that being said, too, these guys got to be ready to go. And that's something that I don't know if people are factoring in. Yes, P.J. Washington shot 40% from behind the arc last series. Yes, Derrick Jones Jr. shot over 37% from behind the arc last series. One, not only are they going to be getting as many wide open, easy looks from the shortest three-point spot on the floor, they're also not going to be in as an easy rhythm as they were in last series. Like, that's a huge component of shooting is, I got the stroke down. I'm keep getting the same look. I'm keep taking the same shot. It's going to get easier. It's just they got to be ready to go when they do get those opportunities, and it's just not going to be as much of a flow. And I also think Minnesota has a tactical advantage, Carson, in the looks that they can throw at Dallas defensively, right? If Gafford is blowing up shit at the rim, if Lively is blowing up shit at the rim, okay, well, we can slide Gobert off the floor and we can throw Naz Reid out there and we can stretch you guys out. We can make Gafford pay for coming over. We'll collapse the defense and we'll generate a lot of open corner threes for ourselves. So I like Minnesota's. I agree with you. I like Minnesota's depth more. I like their versatility more, the different things that they can throw. I just think it's a distinct advantage that they have in this series, man, all throughout the roster.
They have special lineup versatility, dude, and they have a special number of punches that they can throw. So normally, I feel like when you look at a playoff series, at least I do, you tend to go with the team with more offensive pop, and especially if that team has clearly two of the three best players on the floor. And that would be Dallas. But I'm not doing that. I just think Minnesota is different, and they win in ways that you don't always see executed at this level because their defense is so exceptional. Their starting five is so well constructed with so many quality basketball players. Their depth is so exceptional. Their size is so overwhelming. They are just built to knock any offense off their game. Like they destroyed the Suns in the first round. In their wins, they destroyed Denver last round. And as highly as I think of Luka and Kyrie, and by the way, I don't even want to downplay the supporting cast. Like, PJ stepped up and balled out last series. You can't take that away from him. Derrick Jones Jr., when you're talking about the stuff beyond just knocking down catch and shoot threes, cutting as a roller. Like, I think he's averaging 1.7 points between cuts and rolls combined. Like, he can be a big man for you as a wing, running the floor in transition. Like, they're doing good complementary things. They just ultimately aren't the most skilled players. And this is a special sort of defense that I just think is much better set up to counter this Dallas offense and really any offense in basketball than anybody else. So I'm going to take Minnesota in 6. What's your pick, Logan?
I think this is a really competitive series, even more so than you. I'm going to take Minnesota in 7. I think this one goes the distance. I think it's really evenly matched, but I'm going to take Minnesota to handle business on their home floor.
If Dallas wins this series, why is that?
I think Luka just plays up to another level. Like, I think Luka, his step-back threes are hitting. He is dissecting doubles. I just think he steps it up another notch. I would also say Anthony Edwards probably goes ice cold on pull-up jumpers. I think their half-court offense stagnates. But there's this quotient, man, of fight that I just love from Minnesota, man. It's the thing that I hate with Boston. I'm sorry, man. I don't mean to do it to you
go
guys
ahead, make
in
it
every
about
segment.
Boston. Yeah, go ahead.
It's this thing where Boston will take their foot off the pedal. Denver, we saw it a couple of times. It was very uncharacteristic of Denver where they punted. Minnesota may have had bad games, and they may have had blowouts. Minnesota has this fight in them that I just love, man. I always trust Anthony Edwards to rally the troops, to get the boys fired up, to keep them locked and engaged, and I love that aspect about Minnesota, and that was maybe the final reason why I'm going with them. But if they do lose, I think it's Luka and Kyrie play like the two stars we expect them to, and I think Ant in this half-court offense probably stall out a little more than we'd expect them to, and I don't know, maybe Gobert craps his pants. But hey, man, you hit that one turnaround, bro. We've always got that, man. We should hang that up somewhere.
Yeah.
I think these teams are very evenly matched. Like, I could definitely see Dallas winning this series, but I think because Luka's not at 100%, I like Minnesota's strategy, the way they win basketball games consistently defensively, and they got a ton of fight, man. Why do you think, if Dallas perseveres, why do you think it is?
I agree with a lot of what you laid out, but the biggest concern to me would probably be the Minnesota offense stagnating and maybe Ant specifically struggling, but the spot up shooting as well. We saw, although they're a very good spot up shooting team, there were some ups and downs throughout last series. I just believe in the defensive foundation so much that it's like, of course, Luka and Kyrie are great, but this series is going to be really tough for them no matter what. I think that this is going to be a grind of a series because whenever Minnesota plays you, you're going to be made uncomfortable. You're going to be knocked off your A game. I trust that to translate, but it would be just if the offense doesn't quite hold up. But I'm picking them pretty confidently. I thought that Minnesota and Denver were a level above the other teams out west, and I still feel that way.